Let me ask you something. Have you ever made a promise to yourself only to break it 3 days later and not even notice you'd broken it? Most people believe discipline is something you either have or you don't, but that's not true. Discipline isn't a personality trait. It's a decision repeated long after the motivation that started it is gone. This is the story of a man named Elijah who spent most of his life believing he simply wasn't built for discipline until life decided to teach him the hard way. By the end of this story, you might realize the same lesson applies to you.
Before we continue, if stories like this speak to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We share real stories about money, discipline, and the choices that quietly shape our future. Stay until the end because this one might change how you see your own habits. Elijah was 29 years old, working as a warehouse loader on the outskirts of the city. He wasn't lazy. He showed up on time, lifted boxes for 10 hours straight, and went home exhausted every single night. But outside of work, his life had no shape at all. He'd wake up whenever his body decided to. He'd promise himself he'd start exercising, start saving, start reading, and by the next evening, the promise was already forgotten, buried under exhaustion and easier distractions. He used to joke with his roommate, "I've started the same plan about 50 times this year." His roommate would laugh, but they both knew it wasn't really a joke. Elijah's apartment reflected the same pattern. Dishes piling up before he finally dealt with them all at once, a gym bag that sat untouched in the corner for months, a stack of unread books gathering dust on the windowsill. He always meant to change. He always had a reason why today wasn't the day. Every night, he'd lie in bed scrolling his phone, telling himself tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he'd wake up early. Tomorrow he'd finally start. But tomorrow kept arriving exactly the same as today, and Elijah kept wondering, quietly, why nothing in his life ever seemed to move forward. One afternoon, Elijah's supervisor pulled him aside after he was late for the third time that month. It wasn't a harsh conversation, but it didn't need to be. "You're a good worker when you're here," his supervisor said, "but I can't build a schedule around someone I can't predict." Elijah nodded and apologized, the same way he always did, and told himself it wouldn't happen again. He didn't fully believe himself this time. That evening, walking home, he passed a small gym on the corner, the same one he'd driven past 100 times without stopping. Through the window, he saw an older man, maybe 60, working through a slow, steady routine. Not impressive, not fast, just consistent. Elijah stood there a moment longer than he meant to. The next week, his cousin called with news that hit harder than expected. Their uncle, a man who had spent his whole life meaning to get around to things, had passed away suddenly, leaving behind a long list of things he'd always planned to do and never had. At the gathering afterward, Elijah overheard his aunt say quietly, he kept waiting for the right moment to start living differently. The moment never came because he never made it come. Elijah stood frozen near the back of the room. He couldn't move. Something about those words didn't feel like they were only meant for his uncle. He kept waiting for the right moment. The moment never came because he never made it come. He looked down at his own hands, rough from years of lifting boxes he'd never used to build anything of his own. A thought hit him harder than anything had in years. What if I'm the one everyone talks about one day? The one who always meant to start? He didn't sleep much that night. If you're watching this and something about Elijah's story feels a little too familiar, ask yourself honestly, is your life waiting for motivation to show up, or is it waiting for you to stop needing it? The next morning, Elijah didn't wait for motivation to show up because he'd finally understood it wasn't coming. Instead, he set his alarm 30 minutes earlier than usual, and when it went off, he got up before he could talk himself out of it. He didn't feel inspired. He felt tired and slightly annoyed. He did it anyway.
That week, he picked one thing, just one, and decided to protect it no matter how he felt. He chose 10 minutes of reading before bed, replacing the phone scrolling that used to eat his nights. It wasn't ambitious, it wasn't impressive, but it was something he could actually keep. His roommate noticed almost immediately. "You're reading now?" he asked, half teasing. Elijah shrugged. 10 minutes, that's it. I'm not trying to be a different person overnight." His roommate laughed. "Since when do you finish anything you start?" Elijah smiled quietly. "Since I stopped waiting to feel like it."
It wasn't easy. Some nights, exhaustion won, and he almost skipped it, telling himself one missed night wouldn't matter. One evening, phone already in hand, ready to scroll instead, he thought about his uncle and the list of things he'd always meant to do. Elijah put the phone down and picked up the book instead. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt like a small, quiet win. Weeks turned into months. He added a second habit, then a third, never rushing, never overhauling his whole life at once. He wasn't chasing some perfect version of himself. He was simply becoming someone whose word to himself actually meant something. And slowly, that alone started to change everything. A year passed, then another. Elijah still worked the same warehouse job, still lifted the same boxes, but something underneath his life had shifted completely. He woke early without needing an alarm most mornings. He read regularly, not because he loved every page, but because he'd become someone who finished what he started. The gym bag that once sat untouched in the corner had been replaced by a real routine, 3 mornings a week, steady and unremarkable, which was exactly the point. He kept going. He learned that discipline wasn't about big, dramatic transformations. It was about small, boring promises kept over and over, until they weren't boring anymore. They were simply who he was. His supervisor noticed the change too, and eventually trusted him with more responsibility, then a small promotion. Not because Elijah had become louder or more talented, but because he had become predictable in the best possible way. One evening, walking home, he passed that same small gym on the corner. He slowed down, looking through the window at the same older man, still working through his slow, steady routine. This time, Elijah walked in and joined him. Not long after, Elijah visited his aunt, the same one who had spoken those words at the gathering. She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You seem different, steadier." Elijah nodded. "I stopped waiting for the right moment. I just started making the moment myself." His aunt smiled, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Here's what Elijah learned, the hard way. Discipline was never about motivation showing up on schedule. It was about becoming someone who acted the same, whether the feeling was there or not. He stopped waiting for life to force the lesson on him and started training his mind on purpose, one small, unremarkable decision at a time. So, here's the question again. Right now, today, is your mind pointing you toward the life you actually want, or is it just drifting, waiting for something to force a change? Tell us in the comments, what's one small promise you're going to keep to yourself starting today? If this story meant something to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Your mind is the compass. Train it before life trains it for you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.